Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Ashland, Massachusetts. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Greg Ketchen, who I will tell you a little bit more about in a second. We are talking about the history of the Coast Guard because the Coast Guard is on the Cape. There's a whole museum there, the Coast Guard Heritage Museum, and we'll be talking all about it. But before I get to Greg, I just wanted to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And I'd like to thank Greg for letting us share this program with a number of libraries, 28 to be exact. I'll put them in the chat later because when libraries work together, we just make magic. So today we're making Coast Guard magic. Greg has a presentation for about 35, 40 minutes, and we'll be taking questions after that. So during his talk, I will be turning the chat off, although you can still chat with me. I'll turn it back on for you to chat with each other after the presentation. But if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, which is the button at the bottom of your screen, because that's where I pull questions from, and I will moderate them to Greg after the talk. So excited to be here with Captain Greg Ketchen, retired of the Coast Guard. He is actually a volunteer for the Coast Guard Heritage Museum down in Barnstable. And this place sounds so fascinating. So I'm really excited to be here with you, Greg, to talk about the history of this place and its impact on this, this area. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Yes, my name is Greg Ketchen. I spent 31 years as a Coast Guard officer, retired a while ago, but now I'm a volunteer, actually serving as the president of the Coast Guard Heritage Museum in Barnstable Village on the Cape. I am, though, I should point out, a longtime Massachusetts resident. I mention that because as we get into this talk today, you'll appreciate the significance of Massachusetts and Coast Guard history. We are only one of two freestanding museums in the country that focus on the entire story of Coast Guard history. We're here, as you'll hear a little bit later, on the Cape, because this is the birthplace. Massachusetts is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later, but this is it's a pleasure for me, actually. This is one of my more exciting lectures for me because it hits very close to home, both literally and figuratively. This is something that is, for many of you who are Massachusetts residents, should be something that we're all proud of. I'll show a few examples of that. You're going to learn, I can guarantee, some new things today, even those historians that you may not have been aware of before. But let me get into it a little bit. I'm going to take off my glasses here for a second so I can read. Those aren't reading glasses. Massachusetts history is, well, let me go to the first slide. Sorry. Okay, our first little glitch. Okay, I think most of you are generally aware of the Coast Guard. I'm going to start with today's Coast Guard and work my way back, or at least look at what the history led to today. Most of you are aware of search and rescue, small boats, helicopters out rescuing people in the ocean. That's one of the missions, a very satisfying mission the Coast Guard has, but it's far from the only mission. Many of you are probably aware of other missions, and then generalizing a lot. Marine safety, obviously rescue, helping with disasters, marine security, this is port security, homeland security, national defense, and stewardship, which is promoting marine growth and helping industry, marine industry, maritime industry. Some of the other missions the Coast Guard has, I'm quite certain you've heard of before or aware. AIDS navigation, lighthouses. We'll talk about that a little bit in more detail later. The law enforcement. This includes drugs, it includes alien addiction, it includes just general law enforcement on the waters, drunk boating, a variety of law enforcement efforts. What you may not know much about, just a few more examples, and I could go on forever, which I won't, but missions. For example, ice breaking. Domestic ice breaking, that's in our own waters, opening up ports during the wintertime, making sure their economy keeps moving, but also polar icebreakers. That includes both the North and South Pole, and those tend to be larger ships. In fact, very large ships. This is the newest icebreaker that will be out in about 2 years. It's 460 feet long. As I explained to kids coming to our museum, this is essentially the size of a football stadium, not quite as wide, 460 feet long. It's a big, big vessel, larger than many or most naval vessels. Obviously, not the size of an aircraft carrier, but these are big vessels. They're designed to operate in the polar regions. And that's why you don't normally see them or hear about them, because they're up north or down south. But it's an exciting, they're not, I almost choke saying this, not inexpensive. This one will cost about $1 billion. That's with a B, to produce. But it's critical for our both for national defense in the Arctic, for example, where the Chinese and Russians are gaining more and more presence there, looking at natural reserve. Plus, there, as the Arctic, and we have warming of the climate, there are more people getting into the Arctic. In fact, the Northwest Passage used to be something that you wouldn't even attempt to do. Now cruise ships are going up through the Northwest Passage and north of Canada. So we need a presence up there. Some other things, this shows, I chose this one specifically. All our vessels aren't quite this small, and that's a very large tanker, but we have a lot of authority in the water, even with our small size in many cases. This is a large tanker, I think, coming out of Boston a few years ago. We are a military service. We are the second oldest military service, it turns out. The Army is older. The Navy is younger, and I have a lot of Navy friends. I kid about this. The Navy, there was a Continental Navy disbanded after the Revolution, and they weren't reformed again until the late 1890s. We came together as an organization. Our birth date is looked as August 4th in 1790. So we're 6 or 7 years older than Navy. And I have a lot of friends that are naval officers. One was the CO of the Constitution, and I kid them about that. They come back and say things like, well, you'd have to be over 6 feet tall to be in a Coast Guard. So if your ship goes down, you can wade ashore. That's really stretching it too much. But we used to be the smallest of the military services. Now, because of Space Force, we are no longer the smallest, but we are the second oldest. And size-wise, we're talking about a workforce of 42,000 active duty, another 6,000 or so reservists, another 20,000 or more Coast Guard auxiliaries, which are volunteers. The bad news, though, is that we're short on recruiting right now with the economy the way it is, and the recruiting is bad. And we're down well over 1,000, close to 2,000 billets, as referred to, need to be filled. We have new resources, obviously, looking at, well, this is necessarily a resource. Resource has been around quite a bit. Our women in the Coast Guard are having more and more of a presence. They've been a valuable asset to us. The first women at the Coast Guard Academy graduated in 1980. And that presence at the Coast Guard Academy, which is, for those unfamiliar with it, is a college in Connecticut. The Coast Guard Academy before 1980 had no women at all. Now it's about 40 to growing to about 45% of the academy classes are women, and it's been a great addition to the workforce. Again, kidding with my Navy part, I say the Coast Guard is the heart and soul around which the Navy forms in a time of war. But on that issue, understanding that the National Defense Mission is not something most people appreciate, that the Coast Guard is very actively involved in. Here is an example, a recent example. This is over in Ukraine. One of our vessels there, just before the war broke out in Odessa in the Black Sea, training, working with the Sixth Fleet and the Med. We have these vessels all over the world, a presence off China now. Again, we don't seek a lot of publicity. We don't get a lot of publicity, and that's fine. But we're essentially everywhere. We have a lot of resources now in the Middle East, helping out with port security and those sort of things. So again, a few of you may be unaware of this. We have astronauts involved with NASA. These are active duty Coast Guard personnel assigned to NASA. This is a guy named Dan Burbank. Again, I'm going to continue the same of Massachusetts. Dan is a resident down here in the Cape in Yarmouth, and he didn't just take a flight up on a space aircraft as a passenger. He was a commander of, when we still had the shuttle flights, he was a commander there, as was one of our other Coast Guard officers assigned to NASA. In addition, he spent 6 months on the Soyuz space station. So we have a presence virtually everywhere. I'm very proud of that. Linda Fagan again, I'll continue with this Massachusetts theme. And I apologize for those from other listening in other states. New Hampshire, for example, has a very deep Coast Guard history, which I'll mention quickly in passing in a few minutes. But I'm focusing on Massachusetts now. Linda Fagan grew up in Acton, Mass, became our service's first four-star admiral, and now is the commandant of the Coast Guard. She was also the first person to sit on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Coast Guard has a seat there. It's an alternate seat, but she's there on the Joint Chiefs. Now, the head of the Navy is also a woman, and she is also on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But this is Linda Fagan, again, a local person. She was actually district commander in Boston a little less than a decade ago. So she's very close again to Massachusetts. I'm going to talk very briefly, and I'm a little embarrassed by this, my own career, because it talks about the diversity. Mine wasn't a career that was unique. It was, but it was interesting. I loved the experience. Up in the upper left-hand corner is an island called Lampedusa in the middle of the Mediterranean, about 120 miles south of Sicily. I had command of a NATO station there back many years ago. There was a navigation station providing services to the Sixth Naval Fleet. And it ties in with our AIDS navigation. I showed you a lighthouse earlier. Our AIDS navigation mission. In the lower left-hand corner, going to New Hampshire, my first ship after graduating from the academy was a 210-foot medium endurance cutter out of Newcastle, New Hampshire, and Portsmouth. And that was doing all sorts of activities offshore, fisheries enforcement to marine environmental protection, oil spills, but search and rescue, those sort of things, mostly off the New England coast. In the upper right-hand corner is this is a surveys. We're doing glacier surveys in the Arctic Circle on the west coast of Greenland. This goes back to the Titanic and understanding the drift of icebergs into the shipping lanes. I spent a lot of time as the oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol and studying the drift of icebergs and other things related to the Arctic. In the middle is obviously our nation's capital. I spent 6 years there as in charge of the search and rescue program for the Coast Guard, the policies related to search and rescue program. And finally, in the lower right-hand corner, on a lighter note, is in group what are now called sectors. Group Portland and Group Boston have all the missions you could imagine, from again, oil pollution response to visiting lighthouses. There was a variety of activities. Much of it is law enforcement, port security, Homeland Security, and so forth. But this picture shows some of the lighter sides were actually out for regattas when this is in I think there's Booth's Bay Harbor, Maine, the Schooner Fest up there. So again, my career, I'm very glad that I had these challenges, and they worked out very well for me, but it was a great time. Not all of it is great time, though. Frankly, not everything is successful, as you might imagine in any service, particularly when you have people in distress. Eventually, you will, no matter what effort you make, you may lose people. Some of you may be familiar with a film that came out a few years ago because Chris Pine and Casey Affleck were in it, called The Finest Hours. It was a Disney film. It wasn't animated. There's just an artist's rendition of the rescue off of Chatham, Mass. In 1952. But Bernie Weber, who was a coxswain here, considered a Coast Guard hero. In fact, as I'm sitting here, we have two cats. One of them may come by, and the cat's name is Bernie Weber. Just a real hero from the Coast Guard perspective. He went out in this dark and stormy night in 1952 with three others in this small boat, 36-foot boat, not honestly thinking they were going to be able to return. People were out there to be saved, said, we have to go out. We don't have to return. We want to return. But it was a very dangerous mission. They saved 32 people that would have otherwise died on this vessel that was off of Chatham, offshore. If you haven't seen the film, it's a great film. But they lost one person, one of the crew members, named Tiny, as it turns out. He was the cook on board that was 300, maybe close to 400 pounds, fell into the water, and they couldn't rescue him. From their perspective, it was a failed mission. It's amazing that they saved anyone on board, but the measure of success is not how many people you've lost, but how many people you save. But if you've lost a person, that turns the mission into a bad mission. I'll show you one this is not me necessarily, but this one is. The Italian Gold is me. It was the one I was in Boston, and one of my stations was up in Gloucester. And the Italian Gold was a fishing vessel out of Gloucester, and a storm was coming in, but they had just gotten underway for a day or so. They didn't have much on board. Most of the other fishing vessels had come in to the port, come back into Gloucester. This person said, "We've been out here long enough. We should just stay out there." They're professional, very good seamen. This is a good sized vessel, 4 people on board. But we got a distress signal from an EPIRB. For those who don't know EPIRB, it's electronic positioning indicating radio beacon. It's an emergency device. A beacon goes off when a vessel, typically when it flips over. And that's what happened here. We got the beacon, said, and we knew from the beacon that it was Italian Gold. There was a Canadian Coast Guard up there at the time looking for someone else. This is off of the northeast tip of Cape Cod, south of Gloucester. When the Canadian fixed-wing aircraft got on scene, they could see a hull, the bottom of the hull. They said the vessel's tipped over. We had helicopters on scene just a few minutes after that, and the vessel had gone down. It went down very, very fast. We searched for 4 days, couldn't find them. This was I was dealing a lot with the families. Even my wife and I were up in Gloucester dealing with the families, talking to them. Surprisingly, with fishing community, obviously they love their family deeply, but they understand the dangers of fishing. And although they wanted, as we went through and explained to them what we're doing, they're very appreciative. But finally, we had to go to them and say, "They're gone. We're not going to be able. There's nothing to recover anymore. We're into search and rescue, not recovery. And this vessel is down there at the bottom." And we had to back up, but family understood that. We actually then at that point, I was at the station in Gloucester. We walked with the family up to a church and had the whole fishing community came together and had a service for these people. It was heart-wrenching. But on the other side, it was encouraging to see that level of understanding, to say that our family members are out there in a very dangerous occupation, and periodically we lose people. This picture was taken about a week or two later, and we had some submersible out there. We were able to see the vessel. Fortunately, we didn't see bodies at that point, but it was a loss. So that's a bad day, without not much doubt in my mind. So good days and bad days. Fortunately, most of them were good days. Another bad day recently, not necessarily the Coast Guard's fault. I hate to put fault but the Francis Scott Key Bridge, obviously, and that collision and the impact that had and the loss of 6 people and all, that's a bad day. We learn from these. What can we do differently? And I won't go into details of that at this point. There's still an investigation going on what can be done to prevent these in the future. But very often our lessons are learned from, in many cases, disasters. What could we have done different? This is a really short history of the Coast Guard, and I'll get into this in more detail. But the Coast Guard was called back in the 1700s the Revenue Cutter or Revenue Cutter Service. And legislation to form this was signed by Washington. For those familiar with that stage of history, you realize that 1790 was Washington's first administration, the second year. So in his first year, he and Hamilton created the Customs Service to collect tariffs and dues and so forth, fees. But they found that the Customs Service, waiting at the dock, would miss a lot of stuff. Smugglers would come around, bring product in, and avoid paying the taxes. So they understood that they needed a revenue cutter service to intercept people coming in to make sure that they paid the taxes and enforce the new laws of the country. So with mentoring, or not mentoring, but the Alexander Hamilton bringing this legislation through to Washington. Washington signed it at that time in New York City. That's what the capital was in 1790. On August 4th in 1790, this legislation creating the Revenue Cutter Service. That is considered by most of us officially as the birthday of the Coast Guard. Every year on August 4th, we celebrate the Coast Guard's birthday. Going on, there were several organizations that existed back in the 1700s, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that eventually merged with the Coast Guard. One was the Lifesaving Service that merged with the Revenue Cutter Service to become what is now called the U.S. Coast Guard in 1915. And then the Lighthouse Service, all the aids navigation, these aren't just lighthouses, but buoys and electronic navigation and so forth. Even the startup of GPS that's now gone over to the Space Force, but that was all Coast Guard, and they merged with the Coast Guard in 1939. And then finally, the Bureau of Marine Inspection, which sounds pretty bureaucratic, but it led to, during World War II, it was merged with the Coast Guard and led to all the port security, inspection, captain's licenses, the marine safety offices. It's a major part of the Coast Guard still. That led us up to where we are today with the Coast Guard, with many other missions. I'll mention a few other here in a minute, but in the process, we changed departments. I think the count is we've been in five, depending on how you count, 5 or 6 different departments since 1790. Treasury for most of it. Transportation, Department of Transportation formed in 1967. We became one of the core organizations within the Department of Transportation. And then obviously after 9/11, they formed Homeland Security, and the Coast Guard moved over to that department. That only comes up to 3. The other ones were in time of war, such as World War II, World War I, the Coast Guard becomes part of the Department of Defense. So depending how many times you count going into and going out of the Department of Defense, it's 5 or 6 different departments we've been in. So that's the very short history of Coast Guard. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail here in a bit, but just a couple other things that are significant. I should point out, I was a Massachusetts resident, spent my summers on Cape Cod, fell in love with the ocean, fell in love with marine science, went on to my undergraduate at the academy, and then my graduate studies were focused on oceanography. It deals with those early days in the Cape, looking at the Coast Guard and looking at oceanography. It drew me into the service. But the early parts of oceanography and icebreaking were related to the Alaska Purchase just after the Civil War. The Alaska Purchase put the Coast Guard up there as the main rescue organization. They were the police officers, the jailers, the judges, all that. They enforced the laws up there, did some phenomenal rescues. One rescue of a 200, off the top of my head, I can't remember, 267 whalers in Point Barrow that did an overland rescue there. It was significant. These are some of the early vessels that are up there. John Muir, who many of some may recognize the name as the environmentalist, particularly his some of the work with National Park. He was on these vessels. We got very much into oceanography, studying the environment up there. I should go back a little bit further. When Hamilton was, for the few years before he was killed in the duel, he was very much into the Coast Guard officers, the revenue cutter officers in that early name, studying the oceans and providing feedback to not only the other revenue cutter captains, but the other mariners, things like tides and currents and weathers to better understand the environment. This whole issue in Alaska led to our involvement with icebreakers, our involvement with studying the oceans, and led to major expeditions. Titanic was the other major event, obviously a major event from many perspectives, but from the Coast Guard's perspective, it dealt with several things. One of the biggest things, well, it dealt with something called SOLAS, safety of life at sea. It was international legislation to provide more regulation of these large vessels. That included things like lifeboats and how many there were, life jackets, all that, but also led to something called the International Ice Patrol. And they were the people that tracked the icebergs coming out of the Arctic, coming off the Greenland primarily, coming down into the shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. This I won't go into this. In fact, I've been talking to Mina this morning about this, some other topics that would be interesting for future topics about that we could offer. One of those could be the International Ice Patrol. It deals with the Titanic, as I said. I served for 4 years as the staff oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, studying how ocean currents were bringing icebergs down and getting into shipping lanes, and also spent a lot of time up in the coast of Greenland studying glaciers as the source of these icebergs. So the Titanic led to people like one of my mentors, Iceberg Smith, Admiral Smith. He's a lieutenant commander here, but he was on board the Marion in Greenland doing studies. He was the first person in the world to get a doctorate degree in physical oceanography. Frankly, it was such a brand new science. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time at Harvard to get it. His work then, working with Bigelow, Dr. Bigelow, who was his advisor, they worked together with others to form what is now known as the WHOI, or Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. The Coast Guard had an oceanographic unit at Harvard at the time in the 20s. And then when WHOI, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, was formed in 1930, Iceberg Smith was very involved. I go into this for a couple of reasons. One is we just finished an exhibit at the museum on oceanography, and this whole issue with Smith and with Bigelow and all the research that was going on at the time by the Coast Guard. This vessel shown here, the Marion, up in Baffin Bay. For those aren't familiar, that's to the west of Greenland. The Marion was what we've referred to from a cutter perspective as a buck and a quarter, 125 feet. They're up there doing research. Great stories. I won't go into the length of it now. A future talk, hopefully, we'll maybe look at that. But let's go back to Massachusetts, which, I have a place in my heart for Massachusetts for a number of reasons. My last command that I had was Group Boston, which had responsibility for essentially all of Massachusetts up into New Hampshire, except for the islands and the Cape and the Islands. That was another command out of Woods Hole. But I got very familiar with a lot of the activities and the history of Massachusetts, and from the Coast Guard's perspective. Excuse me. I think we look at a lot of the rich maritime history in Massachusetts is lost because, frankly, there's just been so many people and so many events in Massachusetts that were historic. From the Pilgrims to the picture in 1775 on your screen is Dr. Warren, who happened to be a distant relative of mine, as were the Pilgrims, as it turns out. Just again, part of my affinity for these stories. My ancestors came over in the Pilgrims. Dr. Warren was a great uncle. He was one of the founding fathers. Unfortunately, he was killed in Bunker Hill. Didn't get into the later stage of the Revolution or the New Republic, but he was an important part of history. The 54th and many others during the Civil War in the lower left. I throw in this little ringer here just to kind of tease you a little bit. I suspect that I would be surprised if more than 10% of you are familiar with the NC-4. It was a Navy Curtiss number 4, piloted by a Coast Guard pilot leaving from Massachusetts, leaving from Chatham in 1919. It was the first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Should be something that us as Massachusetts residents are familiar with that event. It was significant. Interesting to note that 50 years after this was the landing on the moon. This was 1919. Obviously, the landing on the moon is 1969. And although North Carolina is known as the first flight, Massachusetts has a similar call to fame as far as aircraft are concerned. Just as an aside, too, the first Coast Guard air station, permanent air station, was in Massachusetts. It was first in Gloucester, moved to Salem, and now it's on Cape Cod. It goes back to the 1920s. So there's a lot of history here. Most of it are related to events that occurred shoreside. Boy, there's so much that has occurred in the oceans that are nationally historic that we should also be of which we should be very proud. Spend just a few minutes here. This shipping lane going up, you can see in the yellow is Cape Cod and Boston up in the upper left-hand corner. That orange streak going down to the shipping lanes. This was back in the 1700s, what could easily be called the interstate highway system. This is where people, cargo, freight moved up and down the coast, or even coming in from Europe, would come into major ports such as Boston. But it was an area that was prone to a lot of problems, weather-wise, climate-wise. You see this map here, it shows an L in the center. That's just my graphic representation of a low pressure, a nor'easter. The black lines are supposed to be cyclonic flow with the northeaster coming in. The point is that winds, pretty good fetch going across the Gulf of Maine, causes horrendous, on occasion, horrendous weather on the coast. But in addition, what you see there for topography, you see the continental shelf, the continental slope, and the abyssal plain off to the lower right-hand corner. That continental shelf is where the Gulf Stream travels, and that warm current coming up. It's actually officially called the North Atlantic Current when it gets up here. But that warm water hitting the cold air coming off the New England, plus the cold water coming down from from Labrador and Newfoundland, called the Labrador Current, as it turns out, creates a lot of fog. All said, it's a treacherous area for mariners. There have been a lot of shipwrecks, and again, an interesting story. Again, Mina and I have been talking about that. We have a couple of talks on shipwrecks that are intriguing. I mean, it's like people going by an accident on a road. They're always intriguing. They're typically a sad events. A lot of people have died because of shipwrecks, but um, this is an example of that. This is showing the whole east coast of the United States. The blackened areas you see there are called the graveyards of the Atlantic. The obviously down in a Florida area, a lot of vessels went aground there just because there's so many islands. There wasn't good navigation there, and all the Spanish and Portuguese coming back from plundering Mexico and the Aztecs and all that. A lot of areas where their ships have gone down with a lot of valuable treasures on board. The Hatteras area up further is also considered one of the graveyards of the Atlantic, a very treacherous area, again, similar to New England with fog and so forth. But the difference to our perspective, it's a cat passing over my head. I'm sorry about that. That actually is Bernie Weber, the cat. New England, because of the weather and the fog and the amount of traffic, it causes the treachery of that area and a need to take precautions. And that led to, which we'll get to here in a second, a need to create these organizations to help protect mariners. Let me just quickly show you, tease you a little bit. This will be for a future talk. 17th century, many shipwrecks. The Sparrowhawk went down in 1626, shortly after the Pilgrims came down. That was officially, as far as we know, the first European shipwreck that is documented, at least off the United States. The Somerset and the Witta, some of you may know, is the Mad Sam Bellamy sank. This ship sank in 1717, I think. There's a whole museum in the Cape now dedicated to the Witta. The Somerset, British vessel, man of war, sank during the Revolution, 1778, I think, as I recall. It's I can't say memorialized. It's mentioned during Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, where it talks about the Somerset in the harbor as Revere went by their vessel on a moonlit night, and a lot of criticism, British criticism of their vessel, why they didn't see Revere and get rid of him at the time. But these are some 18th century shipwrecks. 19th century, there are many, many of them. City of Columbus, the name of a vessel, not the city. And the Portland were two particularly tragic ones. Again, I won't go into that, but all off our coast. There had been over 3,000 shipwrecks, and over possibly significantly more than that off the Cape Cod and in Mass Bay in the last 300 years. The Andrea Doria, the Argo Merchant. Argo Merchant at the time was the largest oil spill our country had ever seen. I think it was 18 million gallons, if I remember it correctly, of oil that came out of that. Fortunately, nature saved us. The wind that particular day was blowing offshore, and all that oil went out into the Gulf Stream, was dispersed in the North Atlantic. Not that there wasn't some environmental damage, but boy, if it had been the other direction, brought all the oil into Nantucket and the south shore of Cape Cod, it would have been disastrous. Andrea Doria, not the scale of the Titanic, but still lost 45 people. An interesting aside to the Andrea Doria, again, this is the 1950s. More people have died diving on the Andrea Doria to go down and see it than were lost. There have been 50 or 60, maybe it's even more than that, people that have died trying to get down there. It's at a fairly deep area, but just within a range of many divers, and a lot of people take risks and go down to explore the Andrea Doria. Anyway, let's get to, well, we've got another 5 minutes or so, or 10 minutes, the birth of the United States Coast Guard. As I mentioned, there was a need for protecting our mariners. Most of the sailors aboard ship, frankly, couldn't swim, as it turned out, and there was no rescue organization to help if someone was in distress. So the first was the lighthouse. They decided the first lighthouse in the United States was Boston Light, built in 1716 to guide people into Boston Harbor. Just at the end of the Revolutionary War, 1786, the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts not to be confused with today's humane society that is dealing with animals and pets. This is the first organization dedicated to helping mariners survive marine disasters. It still exists today, very strong today. In fact, we're dealing with them fairly regularly. It began in Boston in 1786, began as rescue huts along the shore, training most of the members of the Humane Society. These were the upper echelon of society in Boston at the time. There was this Humane Society, people like Saltonstalls and others that are recognizable names. They're still existing today, still giving out awards, and they still have grants they give out for different rescue organizations to help out. But they were formed in 1786. In the early 1800s, they were the first group to have rescue boats built and have a station in Cohasset, as it turns out, built. So this is the early parts of the Coast Guard. The Humane Society essentially evolved into, I won't go into details of that, but the U.S. Lifesaving Service was copied after the Humane Society and took over some of their stations, and they were paid. The Humane Society was all volunteer, but that's part of the origins of the Coast Guard. Then the Massachusetts was the first revenue cutter built in 1791, and it was not just the first revenue cutter; it was our nation's first commissioned vessel. I mean, again, the nation is very young now at this point. We had vessels that were Continental Navy, but this is the first vessel that was built. It was actually built in Newburyport. So Newburyport is considered by the Coast Guard the town as the birthplace of the Coast Guard. I broaden it out to say, frankly, Massachusetts is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. These three organizations, the U.S. Lighthouse Service, that was officially formed in 1789, just the first year of Washington's administration. The Humane Society, 1786, although Lifesaving Service was just after the Civil War. And then the Revenue Cutter Massachusetts that was home port in Boston. By the way, just for those that are listening from New Hampshire, the Hopley Eaton, who was considered the first commissioned officer in the Coast Guard, although I have to qualify that by saying there were 10 officers commissioned the same day by Washington. He just happened to be the most senior of them, is from New Hampshire. He had the Scram, which was one of those original revenue cutter, the 10 that were built in the 1790s. But Massachusetts was considered the first to be on active duty and out patrolling. So those three organizations mark the birth of the Coast Guard. All three are Massachusetts, and something we should be proud of. Here they are shown in a little bit different form. This is a map that I have. I collect old maps. This is one from the 1790s, and it shows those red arrows or things that I put on there to show where the birth of the Coast Guard, what locations for birth of the Coast Guard. The middle one is pointing at Boston Light. The one on the lower is looking at the life-saving station in Cohasset. And on the top of the drawing is the arrow showing Newburyport, where the Massachusetts was built. This was, many people consider this the best, or certainly the most famous, if not the all-time best, the GOAT, I guess you'd call it, for lifesavers. It was Joshua James. He operated off of Point Allerton, Hull, back just before the turn of the century, and it's credited with an immense amount of a large number of rescues. This included when he was also initially working with the Massachusetts Humane Society as one of their volunteer rescues, and eventually when the Lifesaving Service was formed, he was employed by them. Great man, again, part of our history. Lastly, just to touch base quickly on the Coast Guard Heritage Museum. We're in Barnstable on the old Kings Highway, Route 6A in Barnstable Village. We occupy this building, and in a second I'll show you others. This is the old Customs House built in 1856. Very appropriate for us to be there because the Customs House, the customs officer there had, as a senior Department of Treasury person, the lighthouses, the stations, and the revenue cutters all sort of work for him. I say sort of, it wasn't clear cut, but this was a place where there certainly were Coast Guard people, what became Coast Guard people from Life Saving, Lighthouse, and Revenue Cutter, would go in here and get directions and so forth. So we occupy this, and very proud of the museum. Well, hopefully all of you can get down at some point to see it. I think you'll be surprised. This is not just somebody's man cave being with hats and patches turned into a museum. It's much deeper than that with a lot of historic information, artifacts. In fact, just a little plug here. If any of you are interested in getting involved in a museum, would love to have you get involved, either as a docent, as a volunteer. There are many things we're doing, including articles, talks, as I'm doing right now, to any number of things, working with the archive. So you're welcome to join us. We have about 40 plus volunteers that are actively involved in a museum and can use more. Some of the exhibits in the museum, this just happens to show the number of lifeboat stations along the outer coast of Cape Cod, the east coast of Cape Cod. There are 13 of them here in the mid to late 19th century. Sorry, a little tongue twister between 1900s and 18th century. But there were 13 of them going up the coast. There are only two now on the coast. There's one in Chatham and one up in Provincetown, primarily because now we have aircraft and rescue swimmers and much faster vessels to get out to do rescues. Went the wrong way, sorry. This is another part of our campus. The building on the left is America's oldest surviving wooden jail, built in 1695, give or take a few years, let's say safely 1690. It served as where they kept some of the pirates that came in off of the Whydah, were in jail there for a while. This is back in early 1700s. To the crew, some of the crew from the Somerset that sank off of Provincetown. I missed that part of the story for you. I apologize. Were brought here. There were 200 sailors that were captured off the Somerset. In the middle is our blacksmith shop. Actually, I apologize for getting off target here. A blacksmith shop, for those of you that are interested in poetry and so forth and familiar with Longfellow. I mentioned Longfellow earlier with the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Longfellow, most of you would recognize the Under the Spreading Chestnut Tree, the village blacksmith. I always thought that poem, Village Under the Spreading Chestnut Tree, the village smithy stands. I always thought the smithy was the person. It's not. This particular building is called the smithy. The blacksmith works inside the smithy. I was corrected on that early on by the blacksmiths here and say, no, the building is the smithy. Again, I'm way off topic here, but just a bit of trivia for you. This was a carriage house for the museum, for the customs house in the 1800s. Inside the exhibit, this is the Coast Guard Cutter Bear. We hope to have a talk here soon. I've done it before on the Bear alone. It's a phenomenal vessel. It dates back to 1874, I think, was when it was built. Used as a whaling vessel, used as a sealer for catching seals. Tragic, I suppose. But then became part of the Navy and then part of the Coast Guard, and actually used by Admiral Byrd back in the 1950s and 40s in the Antarctic for his explorations down there. It served in the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. I won't go into any more. There's a whole litany. I could spend an hour or two just on this particular vessel. But this is a model we have, really a world-class model, as it turns out. Lightships, again, another story for another time. The museum has a lot of kids. Obviously, this is a little selfie studio we have for kids. Blacksmith shop. This is our blacksmith out there working with some apprentices. It's a woman that's learning how to do blacksmithing. A lot of events. This is a promotion ceremony for a warrant officer. Evening
Greg.
colors.
Greg, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yep.
Can you go back to the blacksmith shop? Is your blacksmith drinking and making stuff?
Is he drinking?
There's a Guinness right here.
I think it's they're not alcoholic beverages. So it can be dangerous, I guess, if he had. No, he's a great guy. We just lost our blacksmith for the last 20 years. Been our blacksmith. He passed away in his 80s, but he was still doing blacksmithing. Mark, who's the guy in the yellowish orange jersey, is our blacksmith now, along with several others. And they're doing stuff right from. People bring their rakes up to. I think this may be. I can't confirm this. This may be the last full-time operating blacksmith shop in the country. There are still furriers and so forth to go out to do shoeing, and there are people that do it as hobby. But this is an active blacksmith shop, and again, part of our campus, our museum.
Thank you.
We have a new exhibit. This is the last thing before I get to the final topic, which will be very short on. I'm at 45 minutes right now, I understand. we're starting a new exhibit. Every year we have, or at least every 2 years, we have new exhibits. We just finished one on Coast Guard oceanography. Before that, we had an exhibit on air stations. It was the celebration of this oldest air station in the Cape Cod, the 50th year from when they moved to the Cape. Before that, it was on the astronaut program. We had several astronauts up talking to us about their experiences in space. The newest one going in, which will be opening next month, is the Coast Guard Arts and Entertainment. This includes film. There have been more than 150, I think close to 200 films produced in Hollywood that have been themed on the Coast Guard. Sort of Andy Griffith shown in the lower one, but John Wayne, obviously The Finest Hours, the Guardian, The Perfect Storm, were all part of that. Games up in the upper right is a game called Lighthouse, a lifeboat station game. Even Monopoly now had about 10 years ago had a game that was dedicated to Coast Guard. It was a Monopoly game. On the upper left-hand corner is a Nantucket Lightship basket. That's what we consider trench art. Trench art, we define, although others have defined, it goes back to Napoleonic and World War I, where art was produced in the trenches in warfare. But we've expanded it some to say it's any art produced by active duty military in an isolated duty situation. In this case, Nantucket Lightship baskets produced on the lightship. Toys, again, got to get down to see this museum. We're excited about this and hope to have it open here within the month. Lastly, is we are also working on a major project at the State House. We're putting a painting up there. I'm tempted to call it a mural, but it won't be painted on the wall. It'll be a large, probably stretched canvas, 50 square feet, 50 roughly 5 feet tall by 10 feet wide. They'll be permanently in the State House, just outside the Hall of Flags. This is a major event. It's fairly pricey too, but we're getting it done for a permanent installation to celebrate the Coast Guard history, to celebrate Massachusetts as the birthplace of the Coast Guard. So we'll have those three organizations, the Boston Lighthouse Service, the Massachusetts Livingston Revenue Cutter Service, and the Lifesaving Service, which started with the Massachusetts Humane Society. This is one of the murals that's for the Army, but now the Coast Guard will have one in there. We're still trying to decide on the artist. In fact, as we speak now, today and in another few days, we're going to go out with the final selection of 3 artists and have them do their final renderings. And then we'll select one of those artists by the end of May to work on this mural for the next year and hopefully have it installed in Boston by the summer. In fact, from my perspective, I'd love to have it on August 4th, the birthday of the Coast Guard in 2025. This just shows that where the dilemma is, should it be something like in the upper left-hand corner, which is a more passive scene, or something in the lower right-hand corner, which is more typical of the Coast Guard rescues? It's probably going to be something in between, but this will be a statement that we have nationally known artists that are competing for this. This will be a legacy piece for them to document not only the birth of the Coast Guard, but also having it in a place that's going to have 100,000 people a year go by this. So it's something that's been consuming a lot of our time, and my time particularly, but it's going to happen. So sorry I went over a little bit, still early, but I'll turn it back to you, Mina.
Hey, Greg, that was amazing. Thank you so much for all that information. Do you want to turn your screen share off and then we can chat for a few minutes with questions?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So I just want to say really quickly that Jackie said in the chat that something that I agree with. I used to think that the Coast Guard patrolled protected domestic shores, waters, and searches and rescues, which I think is possibly a common perception, which is I had no idea how much the Coast Guard did until we had this talk. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to jump right into questions. Marianne asks, where do you place the Merchant Marines? I believe in the timeline of, all of the military services.
No, the Merchant Marine is also. I have a lot of respect for them and friends in the Merchant Marine, but they're sort of quasi-military. They are uniformed, but they're not not an armed military service. They were a separate organization, came up separately, primarily during the wartime, to have vessels that are uniformed services that can support the military. Very important, but they never were part of the Coast Guard. We're involved in them and involved with some of the regulatory processes with them. And we often work with them on different projects, but they're unrelated to the Coast Guard directly. There is a Coast Guard Academy in Connecticut, where I went to both as a student and on the faculty there. But there's also a Merchant Marine Academy, which is on Long Island in New York.
Mhm.
We're very competitive. The two schools are very competitive.
Well, I'm going to say that the Merchant Marines kind of squeak you out in the uniforms because I really like their uniforms.
Yes, yes.
John asks, since the move to Homeland Security, has the number of overseas deployments increased and are they permanent?
Yes, in general. I mean, we'd have, for example, people in the Middle East with Desert Storm and so forth. Now Ukraine. Yeah, as I said, I had command of a NATO station. It's in the early '70s in the Mediterranean. We used to have an air station in Naples, and we had another activity in London. We also have Coast Guard people at most of the major shipbuilding facilities around the world, so they can inspect these ships being produced so that they make sure that they can be approved to come into U.S. ports. So I don't have a good answer for if the number has increased or not, but we do have a strong international presence, and that's been very gratifying. We're considered the top Coast Guard essentially in the world, and thus we're being called in to provide classes. There's several that come out at the Coast Guard Academy, for example. We have of the student population, we have maybe 20 that are international students coming from other countries.
Wow. Okay, so
Did
Peter
I answer the
asked,
question?
I think you did.
I,
Peter asks, is it possible to visit the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut? Is that also open?
yes, it is. Frankly, I don't. There's a museum there actually on the academy that's open to the public to view. I'm not sure what hours that's open. I just don't. We're in a process of building a new museum in London, a national museum. Finally, a national museum. Our museum on the Cape, I consider a regional museum. Our goal is primarily telling the local story, meaning Massachusetts, New England. But we tell about ice breaking and we tell about other things, but the Coast Guard missions. But a lot of the focus here. The National Museum will have a much broader perspective. Also, the National Museum will be full-time paid staff. The Coast Guard run. There'll be it's different from ours, not competing with ours. In fact, I'm looking forward to them being open because I think it'll help us out as part of our Coast Guard museum network that we're creating. But the new museum in the London is not going to open until 2025, the spring of 2025. So it's still a ways away, and it was $150 million, give or take, probably a little more than that, $150 million to build this museum. The one in Barnstable didn't cost quite that amount. Quite a bit less. It was all done by donations and volunteers and so forth. So a long answer to your question. You just keyed a couple other things I want to mention about the new museum. But there is a museum at the Coast Guard Academy, and it's not open all the time to get into the academy. There are some restrictions when cadets are doing certain drills and so forth. But there are football games, so it is generally open. I just don't know the hours. I'm prejudiced. I spent a total of 8 years there, 4 years as a student and 4 years as on the faculty.
Wow, you've really done it all. So Diane has a comment and a question. I grew up in the UK with the RNLI with mainly volunteer lifeboatsmen. Lots of history, including this story of Grace Darling, who as children we learned about, also the smugglers and shipwreckers. Just to comment on that, Greg and I have agreed on him doing a shipwreck talk sometime in October. So I'll send that information out in the recap email I send to you. So the question Diane has is, was that Walter Matthau in the right in Onion Head?
Yes.
Yes, I thought so.
It was Andy Griffin on the left. But I do want to say something quickly about our relationship with the British Rescue Organization. They are partly uniform. They're still a very strong part volunteer, but they have also some what we call active duty people involved in it. I went to search and rescue school. This is back in the '70s with an officer from Great Britain. Just a side story is that in our barracks that we're staying in, this officer quarters we're staying, believe it or not, there was a beer machine where you could get cold beer out in the evening to have a cold beer. He would take the cold beer out of the machine and come back to it. We were sharing a room, come back and put it on the radiator. He says, I can't drink cold beer. It has to be warm beer. That's what we have in Great Britain. So I said, oh, well, I like it cold, but it was nice, very nice guy. So we have a very tight relationship with them. But that's another example. I mentioned that the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was the first rescue organization in the country, but it wasn't the first in the world. China was first in the early 1700s. Then the Dutch were second. The third were the British, and then we were shortly after the British with the Humane Society.
Wow. Okay. Muriel asked, what was the first movie that you mentioned? Do you remember when you were listing a bunch?
Well, the one that's shown there, Guardians, but we have in our new exhibit, we have films that go back to they're silent black and white that go back to the 19 teens that we're going to be showing. In our new exhibit, we're going to have a display where you'll be able to call up short versions, 90 seconds, typical trailer sections. But I don't know, I mentioned the Guardian, The Finest Hours, The Perfect Storm. The Finest Hours was the most recent one. That was with Bernie Weber. As I said, you saw Bernie Weber go over the top of my head here in a minute ago. It's a cat, but that's a good film. The Guardian is about rescue swimmers, and then The Perfect Storm obviously is work out of Gloucester. It just tells you a little bit about again our state, Massachusetts, and the ties to the Coast Guard. The maritime history of Massachusetts is very deep, and the Coast Guard is a part of much of that. Not all of it, but part of much of that. And I'm very proud of that. Being proud to be involved in telling those stories.
Elizabeth asks, to what degree does the Coast Guard engage in ocean research?
Well, I'll make this fairly short. Quite a bit, but prior to the 1968, 69, when NOAA was formed, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the Coast Guard had all of that. They were the primary researchers up in the Arctic and so forth. Since that time, NOAA has taken some things away, such as the National Weather Service used to work very close to the Coast Guard. And this isn't negative. I mean, it's appropriate to do. It just kept growing. So we still do research, but for the mid-ocean research, most of our research today is support of universities and other like NOAA and national fisheries. We'll provide a platform. We have technicians on board, but it'll be research that somebody might be doing from Harvard, for example. And this includes not only the open ocean, but the Arctic and the Antarctic. We're the only vessels the U.S. has that will do exploration in those two polar regions, just because we have the ships to do it. So it's a lot of research that goes on there, but we're not doing as much open ocean research as we used to, with one exception. Those missions that are directly related to the Coast Guard, for example, search and rescue, where we're doing studies on drifting of buoys, if a life raft is, or it might be oil pollution too, the drifting of oil and so forth. We do a lot of research. Coast Guard has a research and development center in Groton, Connecticut, and I spent quite a bit of time there studying just that. My project was the probability of detection, looking at the probability of detecting objects when you're searching for them in the water. And that's very useful when you're trying to determine at some point when you need to call off a search and say, the probability of detection here was near 100% and they're not there. So a long answer to your question. Sorry.
No, it's a good one. We're just about out of time, but Greg, could you stay on for another 5 or 7 minutes so we can get through some questions?
Yes, well, certainly.
Okay. So Larry asks if the Coast Guard it was never part of the Department of Defense. Is that correct?
Well, no, it's not correct. It has become the part of the Department of Defense during times of war only. In fact, if I had been deployed, which I wasn't, to Desert Storm, for example, I would have been integrated completely into the Department of Defense there. I mean, likely I would have had Navy and other personnel working for me along with Coast Guard people. On the other hand, I may be working for a Navy admiral or something. So but in place of war, it's full integration. We train with the Navy all the time. It is fully integrated that way. So yes, we were. The quick answer: during World War I and World War II, specifically in Vietnam, we were part. In fact, during the two world wars, we were actually physically part of the Department of Defense. During Vietnam, our people deployed to Vietnam, and Desert Storm the same way. We're part of the Department of Defense when they're over there, operating in the war theater.
Interesting. Elizabeth has a really good question. What kinds of recruits is the Coast Guard looking for? What can we tell our young people about Coast Guard opportunities?
Well, I am prejudiced, obviously, having spent 31 years as a Coast Guard officer. My job is not recruiting. I'll give this disclaimer, but it was a fantastic career. It allowed me not only to do things that were meaningful, but also I was able to get, while in the Coast Guard, a master's degree in physical oceanography, another graduate program in MBA and so forth. So it provided that and provided a good follow on. As I think, I don't know if you or I mentioned it, after my Coast Guard career, I spent 5 years as the director of operations at the New England Aquarium in Boston. And that was very satisfying. It tied in nicely with my marine science background. It was exciting. So the type of people they're looking for, it depends on what level you're coming in on. At the Coast Guard Academy, for example, because it's a small academy and because it's a very well accredited academy as far as academics, it's extremely difficult to get in there. For example, in my class, uh, I say 80% of the class, that may be an overstatement, were either class presidents or captains of their sports team, looking for leaders, people with some good academic quality. At other levels, looking for people with just talents that have that are good seamen, that they have the ability to succeed there. And it's not just limited as it was 50 years ago when I first came into to males. Clearly, women, as you showed, the commandant of the Coast Guard is Linda Fagan now. She's a woman, obviously outstanding job. So there are opportunities there, but it's a variety of professions. It could be aboard a ship, it could be driving boats, it could be involved in port security. We have what would be considered special forces in the Coast Guard. That the MIST team, it's MIST is Marine Safety and Security, that works with the Secret Service, goes out in small boats, provides Homeland Security. So to go back to the other question about Homeland Security and so forth, our roles have changed greatly. I'll make one other comment I meant to make earlier. Back prior to when I first came into the Coast Guard was thought more as you would think of as a firefighter. They're there to help you out, to go recover the cat from the tree. Use that poor analogy, but that changed in after Vietnam and so forth. We became when we got more into law enforcement, we became similar to policemen at that point. Policemen still there to help you, clearly, but different perspective. You have a different perspective on police that if you're doing something wrong, you become very concerned. Since 9/11, I think we're closer to being soldiers. Still are the firemen at heart or firefighter and the policeman at heart, but also there's this armed forces even more so than it was before. So we've evolved and mostly for the better. And we keep evolving, which is great to see.
Yeah.
So it makes my job a little harder when we're trying to document Coast Guard history. We're trying to keep up with all the changes that are occurring. That as I tell people in the Coast Guard that come and visit, the active duty people, what you did this morning was part of Coast Guard history. Now we're not going to necessarily celebrate the fact that you had ham and eggs for breakfast, but what you're doing now as a member of the Coast Guard is history. At some point during your career, there's likely a chance you're going to be doing something that is worthy of being documented as part of the history.
Wow. To kind of build on that, Karen says, did you say that the Coast Guard persons are stationed in around Woods Hole? And if so, what is the emphasis? Search and rescue, something else, military related?
Well, Woods Hole, the sector offices, Woods Hole is one. The Woods Hole command there, Clint Prindle is the group commander there. He was a member of our board of directors, for example, as a captain. His area of responsibility includes all the stations on the Cape and the islands and over into New Bedford, for example, and even into Rhode Island. He has responsibility for lighthouses, has responsibility for search and rescue, law enforcement, not so much national defense, but Homeland Security. So in an element national defense. So there are a variety of things there and a variety of jobs. It could be what they call ANT teams. ANT is Aids to Navigation Team. So an ANT team might be just working on buoys and on buoy tenders and lighthouse renovation. It could be on small boats going out doing rescues and other law enforcement issues. It could be also on the Cape is the air station. That's a whole other category of things. Being a rescue swimmer, well, those are special forces. When I'm on a helicopter, the last thing I want to do is jump out of the helicopter. That's what they do, into the water. If I'm on a plane that's perfectly safe there, why jump out of it? I'm being a little facetious. They're very heroic going in to save people. It's very satisfying. But also out of Woods Hole, for example, there are cutters that go there. So there's a chance to be stationed on a cutter and go out and be involved in any number of things. And those cutters can be deployed down the East Coast in other areas, depending where they're best needed. should point out whether there's many things. There's so many things that the Coast Guard does that are exciting, but disaster response is part of it. When we have a major hurricane, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, we'll deploy people down there. We deploy helicopter pilots and so forth down there. We deploy resources down there. Same thing up here. If we have a major nor'easter, resource will come in from other areas. Thus, there's a strong for lack of a better mantra, not mantra, a strong desire in the Coast Guard for crews to be familiar, standardized training. So if someone is going from a helicopter on Cape Cod and being transferred down, it might fly down on a commercial flight to be on a helicopter in Houston, Texas, that they are familiar with it all. All the training is standardized. So that's part of the issue too, is to not only be professional but be flexible.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, I mean, you mentioned the bridge down in Baltimore, the Coast Guard was right there. So yeah.
But
Karen,
there are lessons to be learned from the bridge, for example. We're not sure what those lessons are. Obviously the what's being said now is they should not have left port. There was electronic issues on board, and that led to the failure. So what do you do then? Does Coast Guard provide more restrictions about checking exactly? There are restrictions there already, frankly, but how do you enforce that? How do these people get through? We have a hard time blaming the Coast Guard for it, but there may be changes necessary. Turns out that almost every disaster you learn something from. You say, okay, here's the way we can do it differently next time. The Titanic is a classic example of it. A lot of changes after the Titanic went down.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think we have time for two more questions. So Karen asks, you said that getting into the maritime academies is very difficult. How does the academy work with the Coast Guard?
How does it work with the Coast Guard? I talked about two academies. One's the Merchant Marine Academy, which is separate, but the Coast Guard Academy in London, Connecticut is certainly part of the Coast Guard. So that whole process is you're applying to enter the Coast Guard, but you're applying specifically to the Coast Guard Academy. It's like applying to any college, frankly. It's if you're applying to be an enlisted person in the Coast Guard, that's a little bit different process to go through to recruiter and so forth and go through the process there. There are also exceptions in a few cases where there's a particular talent that's needed. For example, doctors and other people can do a direct commissioning in. Believe it or not, one of the people that I got to know fairly well, and this is really dating me at this point, is a guy named Otto Graham, who was a Hall of Fame football player. He was assigned to the Coast Guard Academy as a football coach and then as the athletic director. And he was given a rank of captain when he was there. So there are all various ways you can get into the Coast Guard. Those are sort of special.
Yeah,
I
we
get
haven't
in
even.
specifically. I fell in love with the ocean, and I was applying to a number of different colleges, and this one tended to be very competitive. So I really get into the competition of getting in. And when I got in, one real quick aside, I got in there wanting to be a marine science oceanography major. I got there, and at that point, they didn't have a marine science oceanography major. I hadn't done my research enough to know that they didn't have it. From luck, though, my second year there, they developed a marine science major, and we're the first class to go through a marine science. It was just dumb luck. So I may have been fairly smart academically, but not too smart. I didn't have all that common sense.
Well, I did. Greg, apparently we can talk to you all day. We have a bunch more questions, but I'm going to end with this one, which I think is really interesting, about August 4th. You said it's the sort of like the birthday of the Coast Guard. Do you guys have any specific celebrations that you do on a yearly basis or like decades, things like that to celebrate?
August 4th is usually sort of a family event, meaning a lot of cookouts. Usually the crew gets, the ones that are not operationally involved that day with flying or so forth, will get the day off. Usually it's a family event. They come in and have cookouts and so forth. It's just recognized by us there, but there isn't a national event. There are places like Grand Haven, Michigan, which is one of the places. It's a Coast Guard family sort of thing. Cutters will go in there for August 4th, and there'll be celebrations there. Newburyport has celebrations on August 4th because of their ties to be what they consider the birthplace of the Coast Guard, with the Massachusetts being built in. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but the issue is, no, August 4th is, from our perspective, an important date, but not from other people's perspective. I will restate again, this large painting we're putting in a state house. I hope that can be August 4th, so we'll be celebrating something other than just cookouts and so forth on that particular day, a major unveiling.
I think that's I'd love to see that when it's up there. So Greg, thank you so much. Obviously, like I said, we could talk to you all day. We will have Greg back in October for sure, and maybe sooner. We'll see. He's got lots of topics to talk about and obviously is so well versed in all of them. So thank you so much, Greg, for being here with us today and answering so many of our questions.
You're welcome. Thank you. I enjoyed it. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Obviously, I've been devoted the last 8 years focusing on Coast Guard history per se at the museum. So that thank you for allowing me to go on and on like this. And as you say, I could easily go on and on for 2 or 3 more hours. And my wife thanks me too, because if I wasn't talking to you, I'd be talking to her about these topics. She's getting, after 54 years of marriage, she's getting a little tired of hearing all these stories over and over again.
We are
But she is in typical Coast Guard family. You know, wives and family are very much part of your career too. So she was moving around the country with me as I was going to different stations. That's important. So Coast Guard is a small enough organization. So in general, it's considered family. If you go to a new duty station, it's likely you're going to know somebody there. They can help you out with the transition to a new setting, a new community.
Well, please tell her that we were happy to take you off of her hands for a little while.
Yes, sure.
But I do thank everybody for being here and all of your wonderful questions. And I will send out the video recording in a little while, so you can watch it all over again. Greg, have a wonderful day, and I will be in touch soon.
Great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.